Alrighty. Well, welcome to the State of Entrepreneurship webinar. We're so excited to have you and so excited for this conversation to happen. My name is Varsha Kalavar. I work on the growth team here at SecondMuse. And just wanted to start off with a little bit of context before we jump right in. In 2020, we launched our first State of Entrepreneurship study to highlight the needs of entrepreneurs across the country and better understand their outlook on the economy as a whole. 2 years later, we conducted another iteration of the study, which we are super excited to bring out to all of you today, that highlights a number of new challenges that entrepreneurs are facing as we head into a recession. A couple of housekeeping things before handing it off to our host for the next hour. Everyone is going to be muted for the duration of the webinar, but please feel free to put questions in the chat and we will address them as we go or at the end of the webinar. We will be recording this session and we will send you a link to share with anyone else who may be interested to watch and couldn't make it today. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Co-CEO SecondMuse Todd Khozein.
Thank you, Varsha. And welcome everybody to the webinar. We're going to be talking about the state of entrepreneurship in the U.S. Sort of as Varsha mentioned, this is a study that we do that we did 2 years ago, and so we're asked very similar questions to the ones that we asked 2 years ago. So in some sense, it gives us a sense of how entrepreneurs are feeling, and in another sense, it gives us a great comparison of how they were feeling a couple of years ago. We know that entrepreneurship is exceedingly difficult. It's incredibly difficult to start something that did not exist before. You're struggling with understanding what you're making or what you're selling or what you're providing. You're struggling with figuring out who you're providing it to. You're struggling with figuring out, how to grow something that maybe has never existed in the world. And all the while, you have to change who you are as a human because the needs of whatever you're starting are continuously changing. Now, this becomes all the more difficult in the presence of circumstances that you can't control. All of this stuff becomes way more difficult when you're dealing with a global pandemic that all of a sudden is changing patterns of buying and patterns of showing up. It's changing supply chains and how accessible materials that you are. It's changing how and when and why funders will provide funding, or clients will come. Now, this is all the more difficult if the way that power and privilege tends to cut in your part of the world doesn't swing in your direction. We know that economies around the world, tend not to work for the majority of humanity. We know that some people, experience privilege, and other people do not experience privilege. And so, added on to the difficulty already of what entrepreneurship provides, difficulty to the add that we happen to be in a wild and very unpredictable economic environment, adds to that the fact that if you happen to be representing of any segment of the human family that happens to be marginalized wherever you happen to be building this business, these issues and difficulties simply compound on one another. And so these are all factors that we try to explore through the questions that we ask in the survey. And after we come up with the survey and we synthesize and we try to make sense of what it is, we invite some amazing humans who are actively involved in oftentimes have started their own businesses, oftentimes are engaging in the support of broad groups of entrepreneurs to kind of have a conversation to really unpack some of this stuff. And this is the opportunity that we have today. So this year, we surveyed 275 entrepreneurs across the United States and a broader 1,000 people across the country. We do this to be able to compare the sentiment of entrepreneurs to the sentiment of a broader population. A couple of the really brief findings that we found, we'll dig into some of this further on a little bit later, but we found that more than 3/4 77% of polled entrepreneurs do not actually think the US economy is on the right track. Compared to our 2020 survey, it's actually up from 69% who at the time did not feel that the economy was on the right track. The results show that equality does not seem to be at the forefront of the majority of entrepreneurs' minds, especially and specifically white males. We also know that entrepreneurs are divided on key issues facing American society today, with topics like sustainability, climate, racial equality, actually declining in importance of entrepreneurs compared to our 2020 survey. And so unfortunately, the 2022 State of Entrepreneurship study shows that the needs of entrepreneurs, particularly from marginalized communities, are being deprioritized despite their struggles persisting. So anytime we have broader economic struggle, those are disproportionately felt by whatever community happens to already be marginalized. And the report is yet another reminder from underrepresented entrepreneurs and marginalized entrepreneurs in particular that they need equitable access to the resources that all business needs to survive. These businesses, of course, are also going to be ultimately the solution to economic revival and economic return and economic prosperity. So it's not just sort of good, but it's also the intelligent and most natural way that economies are gonna rebound. And so we'll start to explore some of these themes over the course of the next hour. Just to remind you, what Varsha said is we're gonna have time at the end for questions for all the entrepreneurs as we're going along. If you do have questions or if you do have thoughts, feel free to use the chat. And this is being recorded, and so you'll be able to share it afterwards. And so before we get into the discussion, I'd like to give an opportunity to our amazing panelists who also happen to be dear friends, give them a chance to introduce themselves. And so maybe we'll start with Maria from GamerSafer.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I am CEO and co-founder of GamerSafer. My background is in social impact, and I co-founded this company to fight a new, how I say it's a modern problem. So toxicity, frauds, and crimes in online spaces, and especially in games. I'm really happy to be here to have those discussions. Some of these data points touch my life personally as an entrepreneur and many of the communities that I work for. I advocate for many groups, women in tech, women in games, also for promoting online safe spaces for especially children. I have children myself, so I'm really, really excited to be here and to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Maria. Maybe we'll go to Shantae next.
Awesome. Thanks, Todd. I'm really excited to be here. Just want to preface with excuse any background noise you hear. I'm actually at a retreat for Black women in venture capital, which I think is definitely going to be a part of the conversation, who allocates capital, who has access to doing so. But I lead our climate tech venture studio and accelerator hybrid model at SecondMuse, aimed at de-risking early stage climate technologies. I've been a climate tech operator, ecosystem builder, and now investor. And a lot of what I talk about is how climate justice is actually climate investment, and not only who allocates the money, but who builds the products, who deploys the products is so critical to every aspect of technology, particularly for climate tech, where we see disproportionate impacts on communities. How do we actually ensure that the best solutions are going to market and getting funding? And that means looking at the best founders, and the best founders are not only in Silicon Valley or Palo Alto, right? They are from the communities that are experiencing it firsthand and have the ability to build the best solution. So really excited to be here and talk a little bit about my role, but also just what I've seen firsthand from our entrepreneurs now that we're in our second year of running this model.
And that leaves me. Good afternoon or good morning. So excited to be here, and thank you for taking an hour out of your day to join us. My name is Jonathan Romine. I am the entanglements lead at Collaboratory, which is a community foundation in Fort Myers, Florida, so on the Gulf Coast, representing a 5-county region of about 1.5 million people. And really in my role, what we're trying to do is understand how all of our social issues are interconnected. Oftentimes we try to pick one and solve for that when the reality of it is you have to solve all of them together. So we're on a mission as an organization to solve in 18 years all of our social challenges in Southwest Florida. I'm an entrepreneur, love businesses, love startups, and along the way I learned how much privilege that I have had in building businesses compared to a lot of my colleagues and friends in my community. I think the exciting thing for me is Southwest Florida is sort of a younger economy and a younger demographic as it relates to the age of businesses. And so there's a really big opportunity and some excitement around how do we build businesses of the future that are equitable for everybody, for the whole community, but also serve the whole community. And so there's really some movement that's happened here in the last 5 or so years to really start to think differently about how we support business, how we build business in a community that's sort of up and coming. So thank you for being here and super excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, and I want to add, because I
Fantastic.
didn't mention what inspired me. Really just the founders that we get to work with every day. They're remarkable, actual PhDs, climate scientists, way smarter than me. And I'm inspired by not only their ability to take science and really deep innovations, but turn them into accessible innovations and models that people that aren't in the space can experience every day. So that's just, something that endlessly inspires me through all my work.
Awesome. Thanks, Shante. So it's not surprising that entrepreneurs feel like the economy is headed in the wrong direction, especially when you think about the current economic climate in the U.S. and kind of the unpredictability of what's happening sort of in the broader market, not just from like macroeconomic global things, but also in super local within the local context. We know that less entrepreneurs believe the economy is on the right track compared to 2020, but we also know that entrepreneurs are less likely to describe the economy as inclusive compared to 2020. Specifically, 23% of entrepreneurs said the economy is on the right track, down from 31% in 2020, and 9% of our respondents described our economy as inclusive compared to the 17% that did so in 2020. So the question, and maybe I'll punt this to you first, Maria, is is the moment for building a more just and inclusive economy slipping away from us? I mean, have we lost? I mean, it seemed like we were actually building some momentum in 2020, where there was an increasing number of people that have realized, oh my God, this is we have to become more. We have to create a more inclusive economy. Are we losing the moment? Is the window closing?
Yeah, such a hard question. I believe you're here to keep that momentum, right? But at the same time, what I feel as a Latina founder is that we heard so many things about diversity and inclusion programs, accelerators, and new funds, and all these new resources being created. But how these resources are being translated in financial opportunities, in sales opportunities, in new expansion for our business, for example. So in my experience, and I spoke with a few fellow Latina founders before joining this panel, just make sure that I was not crazy, is that we talk a lot, we have those resources, we have those programs, but the system is kind of broken. Sorry to be like sincere, but thinking about, I like to talk about my experience because it makes tangible. So thinking about representation, when I'm negotiating with people, contracts, investments, most of them don't look like me. And they have their own criteria of success, right? And the amount of training that I have in order to succeed is not equal the same amount of training they have to have a conversation in the same place as me, not having the same experience dealing and managing and negotiating with people, like me. So this is one tangible example. And we don't see those, investments translating in more opportunities as well. So venture fund is not coming for us. Less than 2% of investments are going to Latina. I think less than 2% are also to Black founders, women founders as well, 2.2%. So I think the frustration is we have a lot of these conversations going, but how these conversations are being translated. Another practical example, we are required to bootstrap our business to get better terms and to have better traction, right? But most of the times, and myself is one of the examples, we have to provide for our families. So how can we bootstrap while we're providing for many family members? Also, raise money from friends and family is a good sign of traction that you're progressing. Most of our family members are not from a privileged background. They can invest in our business. So these are just like practical examples. That means that we are talking a lot, but not necessarily getting, the results. And by results, I mean getting funded, getting more opportunities, expanding our business. Also, when the economy, gets in the place that is right now, the discussions around revenue gets more important than impact. So I have a software as a service company, but we do care a lot about impact. So lives protected, gamers protected, how many countries we're meeting and protecting. And those questions are completely out of the table right now. The questions that I have is mostly how much money you're making. Is this money recurrent? Most of the times people are not asking about, our impact. Another thing that I was, reflecting yesterday, most of the time I have to respond to preventative questions when my male co-founder gets the promotional questions. So I always talking about risks and how I'm managing those risks. And he's always talking about, how the business is growing and expanding. So of course I am prepared to respond to such questions, but again, talking about training and how we're, committed to make that improvement, the other side needs to get more involved in that change as well. So those are just simple examples that, I thought a lot to come and to provide, because if we want to change, we need to change the system.
Thank you so much, Maria. And I think this is precisely what I think we need to hear is the specific individual sort of lived experience examples, because there's you highlighted a bunch of really interesting sort of dichotomies. One is that this idea of the structural versus the individual, right? There's some things that are like these big structural things, like why does he naturally receive the questions that are promotional versus the more preventative questions that you're going. And certainly when this happens once, it's a one-time thing, but when this happens 20 times in a row and 25 times in a row, then you connect the dots. I think the other thing is, as we're thinking about how to, we've built this world that doesn't work for most of the human family, and as we're trying to understand, well, what do after we build that's different, it's so essential that we have these really precise examples that really kind of highlight what the experience is. The bootstrapping example is another example. We know that the most likely indicator of entrepreneurial success is familial wealth, right? It doesn't have anything to do with what you've built or whether it's a good idea or whatever. It has to do with like how long you have to figure it out, which harms. I imagine this harms.
Another example is just there are so many grants available, right? So we should get more investments and grants from universities and all these different programs, right? So in my family, the first person that I had access to a UC was my oldest son. He's 23. Of course, I graduated, I had my MBA while I was living in Latin America, but he's the first member going to a UC. And in order to get grants, you need to have connections. You have to have access to those relationships. So it's really hard. So the money is there, but how is the journey to get that money? How is the support for us to get money? Another tangible example, in our culture, family is everything. family means belonging. Family means trust. And I can't count the number of conversations that I had with people questioning why I had a family member in my business. So I was born in a family that all of my uncles are part of the same business. So this is something that is part of our culture. And when you try to explain, sometimes people don't understand. So this is a cultural thing. So when you are negotiating with people from a different culture, you need to have like a mindset to kind of understand the other side as well. Otherwise, it's really complicated, to progress in those numbers that will translate in opportunities and all of that. I'm just mentioning these examples because when you put one on top of the other, it makes so hard for entrepreneurs to progress. And I am privileged in a certain way because I was able to get the funds that I need for my business, but I had to find 5 or 6 more times in order to do so to get venture fund. Also, I had support from Headstream Innovation. Was one of the brands that in the beginning of our journey was important because I was treated basically as nobody. Nobody knew me. I didn't have a Ivy League. I didn't work in a company that was very well known here in the US. I had a business in Brazil. I had many numbers there, but that was not credible enough. So it's really complicated when you put one thing on top of the other. We need to, get better in those things. And when you move the conversations in terms of you need to provide health access to your family, how can you become an entrepreneur and provide for your family, right? Invest in your business when the health system doesn't work. So those personal things also impact, when you kind of build this complex puzzle, it makes really hard for entrepreneurs to progress. And I think that's why we're here today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maria. I think that's absolutely why we're here today, because the more precise that we can talk about why is it the case, I think the more that it can share some understanding and insights in terms of what we can do to continue to capture this moment where we have a chance to pivot the economy in the right direction. John or Shante, do either of you have I have a transition that I'm gonna punt to you, Shante, related to the climate tech work that you're doing over there, but I'm wondering if any of you wanted to build on anything that Maria was saying.
I think just everything that Maria mentioned resonates with what we've seen firsthand with our founders. When we talk about folks who are already connected and having access to wealth or certain networks, right, it's nepotism. But when we rely on when I say we, I'm talking about communities that have historically not had those access or those opportunities and resources, it's all of a sudden there's questions about, ethics or, how could you successfully partner with someone in your family when, my experience has been that that's all that wealthy people with access and resources do is partner with people that they know and people within their family. And so I just feel like that's important to say, just to kind of point out the hypocrisy that exists when we're talking about what has historically been a huge way to succeed in entrepreneurship, relying on communities, relying on your local resources, relying on family members, right, who build alongside you, family-owned businesses that have been in families for generations. So it feels like that specific example I just wanted to build on because it's so critical. And I think it shows, which I know at SecondMuse we talk a lot about, this piece around relational capital and trust, and who is allowed to enter conversations with the level of trust, whether that's trust for funding, trust for building a business, versus those who are oftentimes met with a layer of skepticism before they even get to start, their journey as an entrepreneur. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, Maria's point on the generational wealth piece and that friends and family raise that hasn't existed in the same way for people of color or for women as it has for people that look like me, is we have to start valuing that relational wealth in the same way, or those other capitals in a similar fashion, and starting to stack all of those as a value together, not just looking at the dollars and cents of it. And to your earlier, the very beginning of your question, Todd, around is that momentum over? Has that momentum stopped? And personally, as somebody who's optimism, as somebody who has, you know, a 13-year-old daughter, I refuse personally to believe that it stopped. I think we've had some circumstances in this country and around the globe that have affected folks in the way that they're thinking about things. But I see how a lot of the younger generation, specifically white women or white, my daughter's a teenager, so white teenagers, teenage girls especially, are committed to equity, committed to justice in a way that I don't remember when I was growing up. And so I think there's this transition that's happening, and, you know, those who have power want to hold on to power as long as they can have power. And so for me, I feel like there's this tug of war that's happening that ultimately for our economy in this country to succeed, the tug of war can't maintain the side that has all of the power today. Our economy won't succeed if that's the side that maintains the power into the future. So we have to be realistic and understand that this change is inevitable, and if we treat it as how it can actually benefit the whole, you know, you talk a lot about how it's like cutting off a whole system within your body. Well, your body won't function, and so cutting off multiple systems in our body, you know, which is how our economy often operates, like long term, it won't be successful, and it won't be able to do that. And so I think I do stay optimistic that while the momentum has, for all of the reasons that we've already talked about, while the momentum has slowed a little bit, I'm optimistic that we will ultimately get to a place that's more equitable. And there's a lot of factors that play into how we get there.
Yeah, totally. So we're, you know, so one of the other shifts that we saw from entrepreneurs is that, you know, while the majority of entrepreneurs that we surveyed said that they are shifting away from a focus and a prioritizing of social issues, when you dig into the data, you see that Black respondents are twice as likely to say that racial equality is an issue compared to white respondents. You see that women are more likely to identify gender equality as a key issue in American society compared to men. Now, you know, we know that what we saw is that environmental sustainability as a whole has declined as a key issue among entrepreneurs, with a pretty dramatic drop, going from 54% of what we saw in 2020 to 31% in 2022. However, again, when you dig into the data, you would see the same trends where Black entrepreneurs and women are more likely to identify environmental sustainability compared to white entrepreneurs and men. Specifically 33 versus 28% and 38 versus 30%. You also saw that 56% of all Black entrepreneurs see racial equality as a key issue, compared to 27% of white entrepreneurs. And the similar one with women and men and gender equality, with 35% of women saying it's a key issue versus 22% of men. So, you know, I'm interested. I mean, Shante, you work in climate tech. You specifically work with taking cohorts of climate tech entrepreneurs to market, but you're also really tied in with the broader discourse around climate and sustainability and environmental sustainability. You also have a very explicit thesis in the work focused on supporting marginalized entrepreneurs disproportionately, in a sense, than, you know, in the process and in the acceleration. So I'm curious is you can help us unpack, you know, why is it? Does it seem like people are caring less about issues around climate? Is it the evolution of the discourse that you've seen? And specifically, why would we see that the divide in the numbers specifically along race and gender lines for that?
Yeah, thanks, Todd, for that framing. I mean, I'll start by saying that I don't think it's quite different from what we've seen around, you know, is is the focus on gender equality still a priority, right, across entrepreneurship, or specifically thinking from my angle about tech entrepreneurship and building startup companies that scale in a certain way based off of a VC model that is very direct in terms of expectations and returns. I think at the heart of it is, in 2020, we were all social justice warriors, right? All of a sudden, everyone was waking up to racism, and whether that was environmental racism or, social racism or systemic racism. I think what we have now is kind of a lackadaisical approach to recognizing that a lot of the commitments, whether you're talking about Fortune 500 companies or huge asset allocators, have fallen flat. Like, we have data actually tracking, the commitments that were made in 2020 and the money that's been allocated, and it's quite dismal, right? So it's one thing to say, hey, we care about these issues. It's another thing to say, which I think is where the discourse started to healthily go in 2020, like, it's actually not just about CSR, it's actually not just about impact, it's about if we're moving into new business models that work well, right? Whether you're talking about return perspective or an impact perspective, if we want to build better businesses, if we want to build better economic models, then really there can't be the siloing of, thinking about all of the unintended consequences or all of the impacts of business that's separate from the actual experiences that we're having, right? Whether that's the planet or the people or both. I think where we're at now is, I think, losing that, right? Is this recognition that, whether we're looking at what is happening with, Ukraine and Russia, and kind of particularly looking from my viewpoint, oil and gas getting another prop up because it's, hey, well, this is this is inconvenient now, and so this is where we go back to because this is what we can rely on, and it makes sense, right? I don't necessarily fault people for that, but I think it's really important, and I think Maria touched on this a bit, and when she was talking in her previous response, the more that we continue to think impact is over here and business is over here, the more that we'll miss the mark. And I think that's what continues to happen is you have, corporate saying, we're going to, I don't know, give $100 million to Black nonprofits. And that's sort of how they think about their impact framework, when really it's about, well, are you hiring people? Where are you hiring in those communities? How are you thinking about your real estate developments and gentrification and whether people get displaced? What does it look like when a climate, or natural disaster actually hits an area that is disproportionately impacted, and oftentimes our low income communities of color? What's your response or lack thereof, right? And so it's really about moving away from, here's these amazing commitments because we're such good people and we have millions of dollars to deploy to these communities, to how are we actually building and operating a company that is a better company because that is at the focal point of what we're doing. So I think that framing is really important, because when we talk about, do people care about environmental sustainability, I don't think it's that people don't anymore, even that the numbers have actually went down across the board. I think it's that sort of twofold. There's a lot happening in the world today. And so that means people have a lot to hold on a day-to-day basis. And so if I'm thinking about, meeting my basic needs, am I necessarily using the frame environmental sustainability to think about what's impacting me directly on a day-to-day? Most likely not, right? So I think that's one really important piece to acknowledge. It's something that I talk a lot about in the climate space. A lot of times I talk to my Uber drivers or my taxi drivers about what I do, and I say climate tech. They have no idea what that means, right? And so me breaking it down and giving them the ability to say, oh, wow, you're talking about an EV charging station that gets deployed in my community that I now have access to because I'm adopting an electric vehicle. And it's about me having access to actually be a part of the energy transition and building technologies that speak to me as a customer and a consumer. And I think that's what we lose oftentimes in this conversation when we say, hey, do people care about climate? It's not that people necessarily don't care about climate or environmental sustainability. They're not using those words, right? They're using, I care about heat islands in my community or heat waves. I care about air quality. I care about the actual lived experience of climate change and what I know, the words that I use to describe it. And so I think that's really, really important to name as well. So those are kind of the two big pieces that come up for me in hearing the results. It's not necessarily surprising. I think language will always matter and has to matter in terms of how we frame the questions that we ask the people to hold. But then, there's also this other side to recognizing that when we are dealing with a lot of other huge global issues, it might not be that people see the intersection, right, of that specific sector with the things that they're living on a day-to-day.
So I would love to jump in here, though. I hate to follow Shantae because she just, I think, dropped the truth, and we could probably just end right here and walk away. But you're right. Like, you know, it's so interesting, the language that matters. You know, I live in Florida. You know, we're supposed to be underwater in like 20 years, 25 years, in parts of the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic Coast, and Miami saw king tides this year and last year that were, you know, worse than they've ever been. And suddenly we care as a state that, you know, generally uses the term sustainability as a buzzword, or they politicize it or whatever it is, but now it suddenly starts to affect the economy, and we talk about it in a different way, or we need to control flooding, we need to control whatever those things are. And so I think this idea of how we communicate and have these conversations, not just with the public sector, but with entrepreneurs, it's super important. There is no one language that fits everybody. But the interesting thing is, you know, in 2020, everybody was a social justice warrior. You know, first of all, we were all at home. So whether it was on your computer or in your business, and it became this sort of trendy thing where, oh, well, this organization's doing it, so I need to do it, and then all these other organizations need to do it. And then the thing that's about privilege is you can, like, when that stuff sort of fades, and you get to walk away from it a little bit, as specifically as a white man, now all of a sudden the burden's back on the people that are being harmed by the system. And so we aren't fixing the system. We aren't even talking about the system. We revert back to, we get this apathy where it's like, well, that doesn't affect me day in and day out. And so we don't have the lived experience. And so then we revert back to how the system was built for us. And that is about making money. That's about growing our generational wealth. That's about all of these other things, instead of, no, we need to change the culture of the way we do business. We need to operate from this new place where the forefronts of our mind as specifically white male entrepreneurs, that we're always thinking about, what does the future of our business look like, and how do we adjust our culture for the long term so we don't revert back to the way the system was designed originally. And I think what I've seen in my own community, in entrepreneurs that I've worked with, is it's so easy to fall back into that mindset of just growing the financial side of your business versus growing the actual impact side of your business. And so I think we have to get to this point, like Shantae said, where we have to have the revenue and the impact side in the same conversation. They're not different from each other. And that's, again, goes all the way back to relational wealth. Of when we start to stack and measure the success of a business by more than what their bottom line is, what their profits are, can they go, you know, can they be publicly traded, whatever those things are, we have to start thinking about how are they actually leaving a legacy for the future of future generations to have the environment still, to have, you know, employees work for them and things like that. And you know, white male entrepreneurs specifically have to stop having apathy. They have to start focusing on how this is going to affect them and their community and their families and whatever it is for the long haul, because it's all about your community. And if you aren't thinking about it that way, eventually you probably won't be here or be in business.
Yeah, thank you so much. So maybe I'll ask one follow-up question to what you laid out, and then maybe we'll go to some questions from the audience. So feel free to start asking or thinking about a question that you'd like to hear some of the panelists sort of respond to. But we know that in times of economic hardship, equality tends to get worse, not better, right? We have really good data. deep multi-century sort of data that says when economic time gets hard, marginalization gets worse in economic. I mean, we've seen, for example, decades of progress that women have made in the workforce due to the disproportionate burden of familial and home responsibilities sort of get kind of clawed back during COVID, as we've had to sort of rethink sort of family responsibilities. We've also seen the same thing with in the U.S. with this incredible increase in the extremes of wealth and poverty over the course of during the course of COVID. So I have just a question that I'd actually like to ask from all of you. Maybe I'll start with you, Maria. Is what can we do to ensure? You all aren't just talking theoretically about what you're doing, right? All of you are working on a day-to-day basis as entrepreneurs, with entrepreneurs, actively helping to address issues of social justice within the context of building real businesses that, by the way, are amazing and exciting and badass and like all the other great things that like good technology, which is not mutually exclusive to being inclusive, caring, and kinder. So maybe the question is, how do we ensure that we don't lose all that progress? Like, how do we support marginalized entrepreneurs, particularly as we face a fairly significant risk of a recession moving up? And maybe as you're responding to the audience, you can start thinking of questions, and we'll start highlighting those.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, I think a part of it is apathy makes sense, right? And I think there's like a level of humility in that statement. We just tend to not care and think about things that directly don't impact us. And I think that's important to name, because that is like human psychology and how we function. I start with that to say that that's not where the conversation ends, right? Like, we all have a duty to care for each other and this planet that we live on. I think a lot of what I've focused on in my role and, with the venture studio model that Jackie and I run as two women of color who have built this, is equipping all of our founders to be better business owners and leaders. And so that means that thinking about impact, thinking about communities that don't look like you are not a optional part of building your business. They are critical aspects to not only how you become a better founder, but also how you capture more of the market and how you build a better product and how you deploy a better solution. And I think that's really critical to this conversation, because if we're almost expecting people to take on the plight of other people without giving them the tools to understand that, that's a bit unfair, right? And I say that as like a Black woman who has helped white male founders raise millions of dollars for their solution. It's not that I want them to not build an amazing climate tech solution that's going to have an impact for the planet. I want them to do that with an acknowledgement of their lived experience and how it impacts the way that they show up in the tech ecosystem and what they're building and what they can do, right? As they are equipped through the model that we've created to be better founders. And I think that has to be critical to all of the conversation here, because what we can't continue to do is tell founders like, hey, you should care more, you should do more. Founders are building really hard businesses. They are strapped for capacity, they're strapped for cash. And so I actually think it's on us, meaning the ecosystem. So whether we're talking about incubators, accelerators, VCs, I guess I'll say this on record, like VC is one of the most laziest like ways to allocate capital that exist. A lot of it is writing a check historically, maybe providing some strategic intros if even that happens, and then hoping that a company does well, right? And that you see an exit at some point. I think what we've seen be disrupted in large part because you're also seeing diverse fund managers come online is that model is changing because founders are asking for more, and there's also more competition in who gets to allocate capital. So there's a question of what is your additional value add outside of a check, outside of just money, right? And I think that's really critical, because who are we to continue to require founders to be these great innovators and have to hold building a product and also understanding DEI and also building, scaling teams that are equitable and inclusive when we're not even expecting that of our Fortune 500 CEOs, right? And so I think there has to be like a real conversation about where funding and resources are going so that we're actually equipping founders to be better founders and not just waiting 10 years from now to see more exits of companies that don't resonate with the morals and the values that we hope will exist in the future. So I start there and I end with the need to innovate and finance. we just can't continue to say we want all of these things to happen as it relates to scaling companies from a tech perspective, but then there's no conversation or very little conversation about innovation of how we build and structure and deploy capital through financial mechanisms. So I really think it's not just the founders, it's all of us who are part of the founder journey that really have to step up to the plate and ask, what are we doing to change the way they are or aren't equipped to be better leaders and better business owners?
Oh, Shante, thanks. It's really hard to go after you, I can say. So I think Shante said most of the things that I would say, and I think we are lacking accountability systems to make sure those resources are getting into those that were supposed to, and also to make some kind of comparison. How many of those resources compared to the population are being invested? Because the last time I checked, I think Latinos were a big portion of the population, and they were like getting just a small percent of the funds. But I think I like to be more practical, because that way we can, feel that we can then do something now, right? So one of the things that I would love to invite is for us to find people like Jonathan. He's an ally, and we should have more allies. So invite those allies to have these conversations, and that way we can expand the awareness and the importance and make them accountable. With the resources you have, the access you have, what you're doing to make our society better and more inclusive for all. So this is a practical example. The other thing is find, buy, and support business from these founders, count, make your list. Who we're buying from? What are their, backgrounds? How you are supporting them? Thinking of my journey, as I said, I moved to the US 7 years ago. My family was relocated, and I didn't have that many brands in my resume, right? So I found my way to make those connections, found communities that could, support me in finding, that path and being recognized, even though I had like a long resume, tons of experience, that didn't seem enough at the time. So one of the first programs that I applied was Headstream, by the way. So when I applied for Headstream Innovation, I found a community that cared about not only my business, but by myself as a human. And that was important. I haven't seen any other program that cared so much about our mental health, how we're doing besides the business. And that is also important. And then by finding those communities and those allies in the space, you can slowly build your business. And I launched Gamer Safer 2 months before the pandemic hit the US. Can you imagine that? And I had kids studying from home. And I was, I managed to succeed and be here talking with you today. And I totally forgot to say that we are protecting 15 million players in 41 countries. So sometimes I am very pragmatic, but everything is progressing. It's hard, but it's progressing. So I just want to, highlight the importance of those with access to open doors for those that doesn't. So if you have access and you connect with the founder that doesn't, it's your job to open that door and make that connection possible. Of course, we can rely on politics, we can rely on VCs and all of that, but we need to make like these small changes and make them accountable, so our voice counts. And the other thing that totally changed the game for me because in the beginning of my journey, I thought I joined the conversation with the VC and I thought, oh my God, how can I meet their expectations, right? And I was like overwhelmed with so many checklists and things that I was supposed to say. But then I realized by talking with other founders, come on, I'm also choosing those that want to be part of my journey. I want to choose. It needs to have an alignment. And that.
Well, Maria, I think you muted. It got muted. I want to make sure we don't miss what you're saying.
Oops, sorry. So when I decided that I was in the same level of the conversation, everything changed, and I found amazing investors that are supporting us not only with money, with those intros, with those connections and everything. So I think it's important that you believe and you have that mindset of choosing the right investors and go after them, not only let them choose you. You know, that was like totally, game changer for me.
I think I'll just leave it there. I think that was, my mom taught me a long time ago to know when you don't have anything to add.
Well, maybe, yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, Shante, Maria. I mean, that was. I think you, and I think you're seeing the love in the. If you're not seeing the love that's being flung your way in the chat, you should take a look at it because it's obviously resonating. And this is obviously born from like years of deep thought and deep experience that you're offering, sort of like these really incredible insights. Jonathan, maybe you could speak to one of the questions then instead of sort of adding to that. Queen Jade, asked, for example, and this is something that I've heard you speak about before. She said she made a couple comments, but one of is specifically around the commitment from white male power brokers. I mean, specifically, she says, do we as a collective think that these white male power brokers actually understand the issues that we're bringing forward, or is it that they do not understand and kind of have this huge blind spot? She articulates it later. I think Mike Green said something similar around, hey, I want to see this conversation around there. And maybe, because we did see a decline, especially amongst white male entrepreneurs, of caring less about some of these issues over the course of the last 2 years.
Look, it gets uncomfortable. You say things incorrectly. You might do things that you didn't know weren't right, or have historic context that contributed to some of the challenges that exist today or persist today. And I think it's when you've designed and built a system, when the system rewards you over and over again, it's easier to just step away from that discomfort. And when something big happens, like George Floyd murder, it's really easy to be performative and to pledge versus actually write the check. How many pledges did we see across the country? Those aren't checks that have been written. Those are pledges that are checks that may never be cashed, because we know that those things can be changed. And so I think, marginalized communities across this country, across the world, have spent their entire lives uncomfortable because of the way systems are designed. And for me personally, I can say I've had lots of uncomfortable moments of an opportunity to revert back to what was easier versus what was just or what was right. And I think we have to have, just like Maria talks about, me being an ally, we also have to do the same on our own side. We have to find confidants or people that we trust that have different lived experiences, where we can comfortably seek advice, so we don't do stupid stuff that, in the world that we live in, where people just jump on it and do the same thing that we were trying to avoid. So I think there's a level of discomfort that I think some of those white power brokers, specifically the males, haven't experienced and throughout their trajectory of their careers. that it's only about growth. And what I've learned in my journey is the actual sitting in a lot of this discomfort for these past 4 or 5 years for myself has actually elevated like my own abilities to be able to do more with what talents I do have and the things that I want to ultimately build. And so I think, look, instead of looking at it as what do I lose, or, you know, oh, we're going to be equal now and I'm not going to have all of these things, it's actually, it's what do you gain from caring about humans more than you care about things. And I think for me, those are the conversations that we need to start having at that level. Like, you know, a CEO of a large bank makes how many hundreds of millions of dollars a year compared to people that are trying to solve community level problems and community level challenges. Like, what's up with that disparity, and why are we not having those conversations of how we can start to solve some of these challenges at the community level? I think we also have to stop with the politics. You know, everything we can make a polarizing political conversation now. And where I live, I mean, that is what has slowed down the conversations and the care, specifically around white male entrepreneurs and white business owners, is the politicizing of it all. You know, you can't do this and you can't do that, or we're going to punish you, or we have this vindictive sort of response that we're getting. And so again, the system is designed for you. It's easy to revert back to that. And so I think for me, it's more about like, what am I doing this for? Am I doing it to perpetuate my unearned power, or am I doing this because I care about a better community? And right now, for me, a better community wins out every single time, regardless of what I lose, because most of the time, what I lost are people that I probably didn't want to work with anyways, and don't have the same sort of principles or values that I try to carry through my life. So we have to have these conversations, and they don't have to be comfortable, but sitting in that and growing from that is what really will get us back to where we were trying to get to.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan. And to Jade's point in the chat, discomfort is different than pain, and discomfort is something that leads to growth. Thanks also, Michael, for your point about the VC model itself. That kind of speaks to the comment that Shante had been making as well about the need for innovation in financial instruments, where we have to question, and you heard kind of Maria speak to this as well, which is that, you know, there's the way that the world is deployed, but then there's also the nature of the world itself and the systems of the world and the structures within which we're operating. And if those structures are slanted, which they absolutely are, then it makes it even tough. So obviously, this has been amazing, and obviously we have literally just scratched the surface of this conversation. We have two more webinars that are going to be following this. The next one is actually on August 25th, and it'll actually address one of the topics that we briefly talked about, which is the focus on generational wealth, and how generational wealth is so closely tied to how equitable and inclusive an economy actually is. And we'll dive into how capital continues to be regarded as one of the defining factors for entrepreneurial success, but it is also massively inequitable. When you see this is the point that Micah Green made in the chat a little bit earlier, that, big pensions, tend to be the LPs to generally white investors, which will then disproportionately invest in white men, very, very disproportionately invest in white men. There's really good data sort of around that. So we're going to be discussing that on August 25th. So please return to that. And then we have a third webinar on September 8th, where we're going to discuss how men and women perceive the economy very differently. We'll talk about why women are more likely to report that the economy is less inclusive, less innovative, and less fair for them compared to men. And this follows sort of broader excellence. So thank you so much for dear, brilliant, amazing panelists who make me smarter every time you open your mouth. And thank you so much for the questions and the participation from the audience. We really appreciate you showing up and participating and listening and sharing. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Todd, for facilitating.
Thank you all.